The next factoring method that we'll look at is called factoring by grouping. And here's an example. We just completed an example with finding greatest common factors. And when you're factoring, you should always start with that. Always start with trying to find any common factors and factor them out. So let's check this polynomial and see if it has any common factors. You look at the first term, all it has is x's. The second term has a couple x's, so there are common factors so far. The third term has one x, so between these three they have an x in common. But if we go to the fourth term, there's no x, so there won't be any common factors to take out on this polynomial. Following this, in the next video, we'll look at factoring trinomials, and there'll be a lot of times you want to factor a trinomial, but in this case we have four terms, and so those methods won't work. And so when you get four terms, you should consider factoring by grouping. And the idea is that you won't take all the terms at once, but you'll group a couple of them together, factor them, and hopefully you'll get lucky and you'll find a common factor that you can use to take out after that. So let's go ahead and start. If we look at these first two terms, we're going to group those together, and we'll group these two together. And so to start with, we're going to ignore these two terms and just focus on these two and factor out what's common to them. This has 3x's, that has 2. In other words, there's an x squared in common, so I'm going to factor that out of the first two terms. And what I'm left with will be an x to get the x cubed back, and a 5. So if I were to multiply this, I would get those two terms back. Okay, now let's move to the second two terms and look for factors they have in common. And I'm going to use the negative fact. This is negative. This is like a negative, and there's a 2. This is also negative. This has a 2 in common as a factor. Those will be the only factors in common. So I'm going to put negative 2. And then to get these back, I'm going to need an x. If you multiply that negative 2 by x, you get negative 2x. To get the negative 10 back, I'm going to have to put positive 5 here. So now if I were to multiply this and this, I would get my original polynomial back. Okay, now at this point, you can see that if we treat x plus 5 as a chunk, it is a factor. It is a factor in common with this term as well as that term. So let's take the x plus 5 out. I'll write it here. And in order to get this term back, I'm going to need an x squared. And then I'm going to need a minus 2 to get the second part back. So this is our end result. And if you were to multiply this back out using FOIL, you would get this polynomial. It's a good idea to check them. Certainly if you're doing any kind of test, I would check that.